Hey friends, before we get started on this video, I wanted to let you know that the color is really off because I got a new phone and don't know how to work it. Sorry. Today I'm really excited to talk to you about sourdough starter. This is part of the February Ferment collab with Anna over at the Fermented Homestead. Now I've met Anna a couple of times. She's been to some of our Homesteaders of America conferences and she is just as sweet as can be. She invited me to do this collab with you guys. There are so many other channels that are participating in this and I for one cannot wait to watch them. So check them out. All of the information is in the description of this video. You'll be able to go see all the other videos that people are teaching you how to ferment, and it's just incredible. Thanks to Tools for sponsoring this collaboration and Anna for inviting us to participate. We're gonna get started by talking about specifically your sourdough starter and how to make the best sourdough starter you've ever had. Okay, so for those of you who have never started a sourdough starter, we're gonna start with you first. For those of you who maybe have had a sourdough starter, but you kind of had some issues with it, we're gonna talk to you second, okay? So I don't really need to go over the basics with you. I'm going to link a recipe for my sourdough starter in the description of this video, and you can step by step make that. And it's as simple as mixing water and flour together. That's it. Now, that's not the hard part. The hard part is learning consistency and various different ways to keep this sourdough starter going and healthy and active, okay? So I feel like that's one of the biggest questions I get all the time when it comes to sourdough. So let's start talking about what is sourdough. So I have my sourdough starter here and you can see it's just in a nice little, I think this is a half-gallon crock. It's an Anchor Hawking crock with a top. You can see the remnants of a paper towel that I used to have over top of it, but I don't have it anymore because the top is just fine. It keeps gnats and stuff out, and so I don't need to have anything else over top of it. Now, when you get started, you do want to put like a coffee filter, an unbleached coffee filter, or a rag, or a clean rag, or a paper towel over top and secure it with a rubber band. That really allows you to get it going to the best of your ability. So let's talk about what sourdough starter is. Sourdough starter, you'll hear a lot of people say it's a ferment, capturing wild yeast, and while that's true, it's more so it's truly its own little system right here, okay? It's not just yeast, it's also bacteria, and they have this symbiotic relationship just like a regular ferment, right? Just like your vegetables that you ferment, it's the bacteria that's on your vegetables, it's the bacteria that's all around you in your environment that creates this ferment and its own flavor. So there's a few things to think about when you get started. You need a really clean jar and really good ingredients. And so what happens is when you mix your flour and your water together, you are creating this environment. Now at first it's gonna look like just a paste. Okay, but over about a week's time, you'll notice that it turns into this ferment. Now, don't get discouraged if your sourdough isn't done in a week. Your starter really depends on the heat, the temperature that is in your home as well. So oftentimes, if you start in the summertime, your starter will become more active because it's warmer in your house, unless you have your AC unit set to a much colder setting. In the wintertime, for someone like us, we heat by wood. Our sourdough starter, if we were to start it from scratch, it does not start as quickly as it would if it were warm. So some people choose to put a heating pad underneath of it or put it in a warm space, maybe keep it near their wood stove to help get that going. The reason for that is because your sourdough starter is a living thing, okay? It is literally alive. And so what sourdough is the bacteria is feasting on the carbohydrates in the flour, okay? And so you have to keep feeding it, and all of that is in the blog link that I'm posted below for you, to keep it going. Just like if you were to add new vegetables to a ferment, it would keep that ferment going. You hear a lot of people talk about consistently doing sauerkraut, and they eat some sauerkraut, but they leave the fermented juice in there and add more cabbage to it, and it ferments even quicker and quicker. And so that is the same exact concept behind your sourdough starter. And so you start your starter, you feed it every day, And then it gets to a point where it's bubbly and beautiful and yeasty smelling. And now you can use it. And you can use it for simple things like pancakes and biscuits, or you can use it for more complicated things like bread. And I'm not going to show you any of those recipes today because the internet is full of them and I have them on my website. Today we really want to understand the sourdough starter, okay? So what happens, how does sourdough starter, essentially it's a leavening agent. Store-bought yeast is commercial, it's highly processed, and it is an instant leavening agent. Sourdough is not an instant leavening agent in the sense of regular store-bought yeast, but you can use it almost immediately for some things. So some things like pancakes and biscuits, you can use sourdough right away, or the sourdough starter right away. You could add chemical ingredients that help leaven, like baking soda or baking powder, to your pastry type things like pancakes and biscuits and cupcakes. But you could really just simply let it set. Let the sourdough batter set for maybe an hour, and then it starts leavening on its own, so you don't need those agents. Now, sourdough starter is a leavening agent the same way as any other leavening agent. It creates carbon dioxide, little bubbles, and those little bubbles rise, right? They make your bread rise, they make your pancakes rise, they make your cupcakes rise, whatever it is that you're doing, it makes those things rise. Sourdough starter takes a little bit longer because it's an active living thing, and you should treat it like an active living thing. Now, that just means you have to have a little bit more patience with stuff, and that's completely fine. You will get into that routine. So let's go into, now that we've kind of started along the basics of what sourdough starter is and how to get started with sourdough starter, now let's kind of look at sourdough starter. Like, you have your starter, or maybe someone has given you a starter and you just have to keep feeding it. There's some common issues that people talk about. And so one of those issues is there's mold on my starter. Well, that normally happens when you're not scraping down your starter very well around the sides, or if you're not feeding it as often as you should. The next thing is that you don't know the consistency of the starter. Now, you will read blog post after blog post after blog post and book after book after book that tells you have to weigh out everything. You have to do a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio or whatever of feeding your starter. Honest to goodness, I don't do all of that. I'm a rebel in half the stuff that I do, and I do what works, and it's consistently worked for us for well over a decade with sourdough starter. And all I do is I feed my starter depending on how much I have. So for this particular starter, you can see how big it is. I take out my discard, and sometimes I don't. We'll go over that in a second. And then I feed it about a cup of flour, and then I feed it a little less than a cup of water. And so in this video, I'm showing you what the consistency of that batter is. And it's like a very thick pancake type batter, without being like a biscuit, but not as liquidy as something like a different kind of batter I can't think of right now. But it shouldn't be runny, but it shouldn't be really thick like a bread either. And so if you can master that consistency, you're gonna be set. You don't have to worry about the 1-to-1-to-1 ratio. You don't have to worry about any of that. Just keep feeding it until much like bread. So when you make bread, the consistency of the bread dough is how you know it's done and being kneaded. It's not necessarily looking at the clock for 10 minutes while you're kneading it. So same with your sourdough starter, that consistency is very, very important. So we've got the consistency down, right? Now what? Now what? Do we discard every single time? Do we not discard every single time? Here's the question. You're gonna get to know your sourdough starter very, very intimately. And you should, because each sourdough starter in each home is different. Each home has a different temperature. Each home has a different environment. So for me right now, our home is anywhere from 63 degrees to 80 degrees inside right now because we have a wood stove. So on the days that we don't run our wood stove consistently, it's in the lower 60s to upper 60s, and I can go every other day feeding my sourdough starter. I don't have to feed it every day, which is very, very convenient for me. Sometimes I can let it go 3 days and it gets a little bit alcohol smelling, but I can feed it and it bounces right back within a few hours. If you live in a very warm home, that could be a little bit different for you. Now, the question is always asked to me, do you always get rid of your discard? And the answer I give is no. If I have enough room, so this jar, if let's say my current sourdough starter is right here in the middle, I have enough room to put in a cup of flour and a cup of water. And so I do that. I don't discard the sourdough, and it just replenishes it and it starts going again. If I don't have room in my jar, because I know it'll double, then I do discard the sourdough starter and then I feed it. Now, I don't always use the starter. Sometimes we give it to our chickens or other animals. And if we're not using it, sometimes we'll be honest, we throw it away because we just don't have the time to use it at that moment. But you don't always have to discard. That's another crazy myth that we have found through trial and error. And it's just not necessary if you have the room in the jar that you're using or the vessel that you're using to just continue feeding it. So what happens if you are getting ready to go away for a few days or a week or two? You can actually place the sourdough starter. Remember, this is a living thing. So you can place this sourdough starter in the refrigerator and it will keep. Now it's gonna take maybe a couple of days to revive it when you get back, but it should keep just fine. Now, if you're putting it in your refrigerator for more than just a couple of weeks, maybe for a few months, it should technically still revive, but it just might take a little bit longer because there's less of that bacteria count in your sourdough starter, and so you just have to keep feeding it to get it going again. Now, how do you know when your sourdough starter is ready to use? It's pretty simple. You're gonna notice the big difference. You need to know what a unfed sourdough starter is and what a fed sourdough starter is. Now, a very active sourdough starter, so it's been fed within 12 hours. It's very puffy. It has lots of bubbles. It's very active. That is something that you would definitely want to try to use for things like pastries and pancakes. For something like breads, you can use a less active sourdough starter, but essentially I have found there's not much of a difference except for time. So if I use a very active sourdough starter in a bread or a pancake or whatever, I find that it does rise more efficiently, but I have also used a less active sourdough starter and it will still rise. It just might take longer, or it might not be as fluffy as you would like it to be. The density is much heavier, of course, if you were to use one that's not quite been fed as soon and isn't as active. Now, let's talk about flour and different types of grains for your sourdough, and then we'll probably end there because I feel like that gives you enough information for you to efficiently get started with a sourdough starter while simultaneously using all the instructions below in the blog post that I gave you. And I have tons of recipes on my website as well. So I want to caution you with the grains that you use. So you can see I have a grain mill behind me. We do mill our own grains. We also do get unbleached organic flour from Azure Standard or from the Mennonite store nearby. And so there is a major difference. So I want to caution you with that so you're not discouraged. If you use just unbleached white flour, you're going to get that typical very fluffy, lots of holes sourdough bread. But if you are to use your own milled grains, your bread is going to be a lot denser than it would be if you were using processed flour. And that's because even if you sift it to make your own all-purpose flour, it's still going to be quite a bit more dense than it would be if you would just use the store-bought regular all-purpose flour. It's not a bad thing. It still works great, but I do encourage you to experiment. But also remember that as your starter ages, okay, as this living organism ages, it will create a fluffier bread, no matter whether you're milling your own grains or using store-bought flour. It will become more efficient as the months go by and as the years go by even. And it will create a more fluffy bread because it has learned how to efficiently break down those carbohydrates. One final tip for me before we get off here and you go check out all the other amazing videos that people are posting. If your sourdough starter is just really having a hard time getting going, you can add good bacteria to your starter in a natural way by adding a couple of tablespoons of raw milk to your starter. Now, I know that sounds really crazy. For cheesemakers out there, it probably doesn't sound as crazy, but for some people who are already like, oh my gosh, raw milk is gonna kill you, it's not, I promise. Raw milk has some incredible bacteria in it that is natural. It does not go bad, and it only enhances the flavor of your sourdough starter. And so there have been years where I've had to restart a sourdough starter or whatnot, and my starter just would not catch fire, right? Add in a couple of tablespoons of milk, or even your whole cup of milk even. You don't have to do it every time, but it will get that bacteria going. It will help that starter rejuvenate, or just help it really steadfastly work. I do recommend using raw milk, not necessarily store-bought milk, because raw milk has way more bacteria that is good in it for you. But I just thought I would leave you with that tip in case you're still struggling. You're like, I've tried all of this and I still don't know what to do. The milk is the key. The raw milk is the key for you. So hopefully that helps. All right, guys, thank you for joining me for this video. Don't forget to like it, subscribe it, and share. Check out all the other people in the video comments or in the description below. That way you can check out all the other amazing ferment videos. Thank you, Anna, so much for inviting me to this collaboration. I don't do a lot of collaborations, but I was like, you know what? I really want to talk about sourdough starter because I get questions about it all the time, and I have all the information already on my website, so you can check it out below. All right, guys, thanks for having me, and happy homesteading.